Welcome to another episode of Uncovered. I'm Jarrod, Kimber. Unfortunately, Parrots from the Racing has found a new excuse. In fact, it's the same excuse as last week. He changed houses, moved into a new place, and his Wi-Fi is not working at the moment. He's still working. So if you're a Wi-Fi technician anywhere near the Adelaide Hills, please get in touch with Burra if you want him to be on this or any other podcasts in the future. But we're finally in the same time zone because I'm in Australia. Trying to think of what's the best Australian story I can tell you about coming out. Well, I've got two. So I went to a supermarket today to pick up some stuff, and as I was going through, I found a deodorant, and the deodorant was in the, well, I want to say flavor. What do you say? The aroma of Solo. Solo was a famous old lemon drink that used to get sold a lot in Australia, and probably doesn't get sold as much these days as it used to, but it was a very famous old drink. And now you can buy it as a deodorant. So that's something. And the other thing that I saw was just, I'd forgotten, and I'm a frequent swearer. I was even considered probably a high octane swearer in Australia when I lived there. But it is incredible to go from another country, well, a couple of countries actually, and then fly into Australia and just be overwhelmed by the casual swearing again. So just great to be back home. I did stop for in Disney for a day on the way through. My favorite thing about Los Angeles on the way to Disney was seeing a store that said Donut King and water. There's a store for all of us, I think. But let's the game I saw the most of. I've seen a little bit of the IPL games, but not focused on them as much. But the game I saw a lot of was the Sri Lanka New Zealand game, the T20 game, and it's an interesting game, isn't it? Because it's a proper, what would you say, 70% game. Best players from either team are obviously, busy with IPL duties. But it does give you a really good idea at sort of what the depth is like. It also allows the teams to be a little bit more creative. So I could see why. What's the best way of putting it? I could see why playing some internationals during the IPL window actually might give you a bit of a benefit because you're still going up against generally international quality players. I didn't think there was anyone in either of those two sides I was like, shouldn't be out there. But, a player like Mark Chapman gets a more of a chance than he probably would in other games. But the really interesting thing I thought was if you can keep playing those sorts of games, you have the ability to develop your players in internationals that people aren't following as much. But they, and still at that level of cricket, it's a really, really interesting development tool. And I'm positive that's not why these teams are playing. It's probably just one of the scheduling kicks that they can get over. But I do think going ahead is really interesting. But the other thing I thought about, well, actually, I had two other really interesting thoughts about that particular game. One was that T20 cricket on a small ground, I don't know what the inches are in Auckland, but it feels like 8 inches wide, right? Is so hitting a stick to tie the game, the last ball from a flick off his pads, good on him, but it's a different world when someone like Ishodi can play a shot like that. But I did think from a perspective of we've already seen some leagues have substitutions. We've got obviously the T10 with the 100. There's all these little things around there, but having a much smaller playing surface is a really interesting secondary sort of thing. And I remember going to a lot of cricket in Nottingham when Trent Bridge brought the ropes in so far. They were, I think, sometimes so. And it was a different kind of T20 game. And it's not to say that it's better or worse, but again, it's another, it's almost like a separate product because it is a different kind of T20 game. It's much more about the boundaries, less about other tactical, issues that you might use or anything else. But I thought it was a very, fun game of cricket. I think that's the only one of that series I've seen so far. Obviously watched a little bit of IPL and stuff, even when I was on the plane. At times I got to see some of that. This is the other thing I wanted to mention about the New Zealand Sri Lanka game. I think it was just that T20 I was talking about, the one that went down to the super over that Sri Lanka won, where New Zealand, I think it's Spark, isn't it, in New Zealand broadcasting, they had Maori commentators. It's really interesting. I've had these conversations before with people about this. In fact, I've had very, very angry people say to me that, my pushing for non-English cover of cricket is in itself racist because, I think that people from certain countries can speak English. But it's not just about that. It's about inclusion. And I remember when, I think it was the first one I remember ever doing this was the Japan cricket. They start tweets in 2 different languages quite regularly, for English speakers in Japan who like cricket and for Japanese speakers in Japan who might like cricket as well. And to me, it just seemed like a fairly natural thing to do. And we've seen, I think I was talking to someone from Star recently, and they said that 70% of the cricket coverage in the IPL was followed by people watching the Hindi broadcast. The IPL, I think, has been pretty good at having multiple languages for a little while now. I think there's always a big problem with language in cricket, and I'm not sure it's one that's easily overcome. But I'll tell you a little story about when I was covering Afghanistan at the World Cup. I think this was in 2019, and I went to contact a player. I can't remember who it was now, but it was one of their younger players, and I wanted to chat to him. And I asked something along the lines of, who I could talk to, because I knew he didn't speak English, and there was no one in the team available, from the off-field side of things to actually help with that. And so in the end, he did the interview in Urdu, but he did it away because the Afghanistan management had told him he wasn't allowed to speak Urdu in any interviews. And so I think there was a Pakistani in the room who helped me out with the translation. It was only a short, 5-10 minute interview. But the interesting thing was that it was a big deal for the Afghanistani cricket board to not allow him to speak Urdu, but they didn't also make anyone available to speak to him, speak on his behalf for any other languages. So he had no translators there. I've seen cool. Yeah, it was years ago. Misspoke at a press conference where I don't think there was any Pakistani press there. I don't remember any, but there was a lot of Australian press at this particular press conference, and he accidentally got his wording wrong, and he meant to say that Ricky Ponting was a really good player, and accidentally made it sound like Ricky Ponting was a really poor player. Again, there was no one there. I saw an Indian tour where one of the media had to go up and do translation for the player. I can't remember. I want to say it was Umesh Yadav, but I can't remember who the player, if it was him or someone else. But again and again, these sorts of things come up. I've talked about pronunciations in cricket as well. You've got 4,000 professional players from all different kinds of backgrounds, within countries like England and Australia, you get strange pronunciations. Marnus Labuschagne is a perfect example. That's an Australian pronunciation of Labuschagne. Got that one wrong. The South African pronunciation, Moses Enriquez, Moses Enriques. You've even got things like R. Ashwin, Ravichandran Ashwin, and Sanal Gavaskar still calls him Ravi Ashwin, despite the fact that he's asked not to be called that. There's a real problem with languages and names in cricket, and so I know it's a small thing, and I'm not sure it changed cricket massively in New Zealand, but to have the option of having being covered in a local language, a different language, something that probably appeals to a slightly different market than the normal cricket market in New Zealand, I think it's a really, really good thing, even if it doesn't change, cricket forever. All these things are a good step towards making our game more inclusive, and considering our game has been as uninclusive as possible many times. With very interesting things going on with Scottish cricket at the moment, with the new guy stepping down there. Obviously, the Yorkshire racism committees just come out, and some players were proven to be racist, but others that were unproven, and everything else. Like, there's a lot of issues within cricket around the world when it comes to these sorts of things. So it was sort of nice to see the other side of that, of Cricket New Zealand really trying to come together, and probably also find a newer audience that, as I said, isn't a traditional cricket audience. On to the IPL. Mumbai Indians. I thought it was funny that they use their super sub on a left-arm seam bowler, being that Mumbai Indians are, I don't know, is there a cricket team with more left-arm pace than Mumbai Indians? Perhaps Pakistan. It just seems that Mumbai, they've decided to have as many options as they can when it comes to left-arm seam. Jason Behrendorff was brought in as the super sub. It made sense. He bowled, the first over, so brand new ball, everything you want him to do. And of course, he goes for 37 in 3 overs as Virat Kohli and Faf. I took him everywhere. I'm trying to think. I reckon Virat's got an average record against left-arm pace, but I think Faf might be one of those guys who really likes it. But even so, Behrendorff, he probably just hasn't played enough cricket over the years. When he has played and he gets on a bit of a run, he becomes unplayable for little bits and pieces. But I think sometimes it does take him a little bit longer to amp up and, come back from all those injuries. But I thought it was very interesting they went with that. Lucknow's super sub was Gautam, who came in to face one ball at the end of the innings. That's kind of a perfect way of doing it. I really thought that was quite interesting, bringing in the guy to slog one or two with him, and he could bowl a bit. And what I think what we're seeing with this pattern at the moment is that it is probably going away from traditional all-rounders. So I think if we're going to do this, it would make more sense if, went with my system. Maybe my system of 15 players is too many, but 13 players, and allow, tagging in, tagging out, all those sorts of things, I think makes a lot more sense going forward. But even as it is, I find it's certainly, I think it is a good way of T20 cricket, again, differentiating itself from the other forms of the game. And on the all-rounders point that I made, I saw Cameron Green went for 30 runs in 2 overs. I've said this before. His bowling is so fascinating to see where it goes and what direction it ends up in, because there's nothing that I've seen in his bowling so far that makes me think he's an IPL bowler. I'm not even sure he's a white ball bowler at the moment. But I will say this, when he came into Test cricket, despite the fact he had very good figures, you watched him early on and you're like, I'm not sure he really understands bowling yet. And he could be the opposite, of the sort of player that we talk about. Well, actually, he might be someone a little bit more similar to someone like Imran Khan, who I suppose had the natural attributes of a fast bowler, but it took me a very long time to work out how to do it. But I want to see how often Cameron Green gets used and how that goes. But yeah, 30 runs for 2 overs in his first one. I don't have that many other IPL thoughts, if we're being honest. I, dipped in and out of it a little bit. Obviously was flying, watched some of it on small screens and everything else. But it's back, and I'm sure by next week and the week after, I'll have a million more thoughts for you. If you haven't seen it, we've got some really interesting T20 stuff coming up, and we've already put it up. The video on Scoops, I thought it was really interesting going through the numbers and seeing the history of Scoops. And for those of you who don't know, how batting has changed over the years and how the Scoops have played a large part in that was quite interesting, and how there still aren't many players who actually play it that much other than Tobias Visse, the former Dutch player. Hasn't played for them in a while, I don't think. And Gunnar Thalaka, who uses a lot. It's really a shot that is used so minimally, but obviously gets massive impact. So we've done a video on that. And we had the Harmanpreet one, of course, as well, that came out just beforehand, which was more WPL focused, although it was really more about her innings against Australia in the 2017 World Cup. And I'm working on a couple of videos at the moment, one on Samuel Badri and leg spinners opening or bowling in the power play, I suppose. Another one's on Faf. So, huge shout out to Faf for making some runs there. Always great. It's funny when you work in cricket media for so long. I think the thought is that everyone's biased towards a team and all this sort of stuff. Whereas anyone who's ever worked in cricket or in any sport will say that you're basically, if you're writing or creating media, you're cheering on the narrative, whether it be your narrative or the narrative that will help you get more hits or anything else. So I don't think I've ever thought to myself, oh, it's great that Faf has made runs in an IPL game. But when he did in this one, I was like, oh, thanks, mate. All right, we'll have a short break. And then after this break, we've got plenty more. I want to talk about the women in Australia specifically and getting paid. So you're listening to Uncovered with Jarrod, Kimber, and not the other guy. If you like what we are making here and you want to know if you can help out, well, you can. On top of asking super chats on our lives, you can also support us through Patreon or buy me a coffee. The more support we can get, the better and more videos we can make. On Patreon, there are plenty of other things we offer too, like a Discord server, the chance to ask questions directly, AMAs, and early versions of our recordings. This channel only exists because people like you help support it. We have to buy equipment, software, pay wages, and my mortgage, I suppose, just to make this stuff happen. And if you don't have any money available to spend, it isn't just your money we want. Shares, likes, retweets, comments, subscriptions, the little bell icon thing, all of it. They help us build and become more professional, make more videos, better videos, all that sort of stuff. So thank you for watching everything we make and for all your support so far. Welcome back to Uncovered. There's some questions in the chat already, so I've started some of those. And I'll get to them at the end. I should say, if you definitely want your question answered, obviously super chat is the best option. If you're just chipping in late and you're like, Bharat's not here again, yeah, he's got no Wi-Fi. That's what he says. We'll see what the next excuse is, but that's where he's sticking at the moment. Yeah, so the Australian women's cricket have changed, or Cricket Australia, I should say, have changed their pay structure for Australian women's cricket. Let me put all my notes up actually near the computer because I'm looking over. I'm in a Airbnb and it's all a bit weird. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting development that the top woman now, I think, can earn, I think it's about 800,000 Australian. So I don't know what the exchange rate with the US is, but that's probably more than $500,000 US, I would have thought, or at least around that number if you're not from Australia. But that's a lot of money, obviously, for a woman. That's across, I think, the Women's Big Bash and the international contracts. We know that Australia's been far ahead of the game with this. There's absolutely no doubt that India could certainly match this and then better it if they wanted to or had the desire to do so. England would certainly be able to match it, but their contract structures are a lot different because there's so many first-class cricketers or professional cricketers across the men's and women's game now in England that the whole pay structure thing works a lot differently in England than it does in Australia. So I think it's always easier for Australia to pay their top players more than it probably is in England, even though ECB makes more money. None of the other boards. I mean, how long before we would ever see New Zealand, Sri Lanka, West Indies, South Africa, Pakistan pay their top women $500,000 US? I mean, it's a way. And, that comes back to the whole space race thing, because I think we've seen space races at times in cricket. Obviously, the West Indies was, I don't want to say a fluke because it seems like that's the wrong way of putting it, but it wasn't the West Indies cricket board at that time that Cricket West Indies now that made the West Indies great, but there was a confluence of a lot of different factors that came together that did that. And then obviously you would say that Australia was the next one where they basically just got professional so much quicker than anyone else. So we've seen that in the men's game, but the women's game, from the moment the Australian women went professional, there's just been a huge difference, hasn't there, between the standard of them and everyone else. Obviously, the England women had a little bit of a bump even when they did it. WPL, we'll see what sort of impact that has on Indian women's cricket. But it does feel at the moment that women's cricket is probably going to be dominated by the three major teams over the next 3 to 15 years, just because that they would be the places where the most professionals will happen. But that doesn't mean there won't be, again, I don't want to call them fluke, but not what's the best way of putting it? Non-board related success. Put it that way, where you can suddenly have a situation where the what's the best way of putting it? Yeah, where you can suddenly have a situation where, I don't know, like what happened with South Africa when the South African women got good. You don't hear many people crediting Cricket South Africa with that. What you really are saying at that point is they got really good because they factored into a lot of overseas tournaments, and then a group of 6 to 8 of them all upskilled at the same time. Perhaps that will happen again in the future, but it just looks like, the way that Cricket Australia are doing things and the way the other two major boards will do things, it's going to be really tough for everyone. The other thing I wanted to talk about actually with the women's wages is that the Australian men, back on their last MOU, really fought for the women. In fact, it got to the point that Cricket Australia haven't got as much flack for this as they should have, but they tried to wedge the women and the men against each other a little bit in those negotiations. And when I started covering the cricket, I would say that the Australian men didn't treat the Australian women like they were even cricketers, let alone cricketers who they would ever fight for. And I think the Mitchell Starc Alyssa Healy thing really did change things a lot in that relationship. So going forward, it's interesting again that the Players Association are happy, and obviously gives them more members as well, but that they're fighting for the women and the men. It'd be interesting to talk to some of the men off the record and see how they feel about this. But I would have thought this just feels right and where the game should be going. And we obviously saw other things with New Zealand women's cricket not that long ago that we might have talked about on another Uncovered. So it does feel like a really good step in the right direction. The other thing that changed in the pay structure of, or appears to be changing in the pay structure of Australian cricket, is that the Big Bash is getting, I think it's an extra third. I think it was $2 million Australian dollar salary cap, and it's going up to a $3 million. That's a big jump. When I was working with the Big Bash teams, they just knew they couldn't outbid anyone. And at that point, they were getting absolutely hammered by Bangladesh because Bangladesh had owners. And of course, those owners were willing to pay for ABWs to cover a handful of games. And, Cricket Australia would pay for some of those players, but they could only get one or two and they couldn't get the depth. And, it wasn't quite the same. Really interesting that salary cap, it has to go up because of the UAE League and the South African League. It probably still isn't high enough, but it's a really, really interesting thing that they've done that now. Had they done it a couple of years earlier, they might have got themselves in a position where they were the major destination for overseas players at that time of the year. I think now it's maybe too little too late, but it'd be very good for a lot of domestic players as well. So also, having spent some time in Australia the last couple of days, you do realize how many of the Big Bash players are quite well known in Australia now. It's free to air, prime time, all the way through summer. It's from that point of view, it's a very good competition to get players involved and watch. Get players known, I should say, who normally you wouldn't know. Back in my day when I was a kid, we knew about Richard Cheekwee and who else? Joe Scuderi and that sort of level of player. But you had to be a hardcore cricket fan, and I don't think you do now. So I do think that with that league being so successful, the players deserve to also get paid that little bit more money. Some of the money going back wasn't particularly good. So really interesting from a financial point of view. I didn't get to go through everything. I think I read a couple of articles. Nash's got one up on Cricinfo, and there's a couple others out there. But it's a really interesting development for Australian cricket. All right, let's take another break. And then after the break, he says he can't even find the breaks because he's an idiot. Here. And then after the break, we will take a little bit of a look at South Africa versus Netherlands, which I thought was quite interesting.
A little bit of grass on the wicket is good, but too much and all hell breaks loose. Not enough and things can go sideways very quick. The same is true of your pubic hair. And you don't have a groundsman who smells like fertilizer telling you what to do. No, you are the curator of your own pubic pitch. So if you're having trouble grooming your pitch, what about Manscaped? They've invented a sleek, well-designed, optimized trimmer that helps you shave your balls. I've used it, and it's incredible. It's good enough to use at Lord's. So get 20% off and free worldwide shipping with the code REDINKA. And you just put that in at manscaped.com. That's 20% off, free worldwide shipping, manscaped.com. The code is REDINKA. I always thought this podcast took balls more seriously than anyone else. Then I tried Manscaped.
All right, South Africa versus Netherlands. So this is obviously a massively important. I was trying to think about this the other day. Outside of the World Cup qualifiers, when West Indies were going up against teams like Scotland and snuck their way through to 2019, this South Africa Netherlands is a massively important event that isn't really getting much coverage. And because it's South Africa Netherlands, I understand the general point of it, but you do have a situation where, of course, South Africa is desperate to qualify for this World Cup. So in the game the other day, they made 370 versus the Netherlands. Their batting is steady as a rock in one-day cricket, despite the fact that they only go in with 6 players. I made a video about it. It's not that long ago, maybe a couple of months ago. It's a really, really interesting one, the way so many of their batters made runs. But, of course, so many of their batters are not around at the moment because they're off in other places, and they had Markram, didn't they? Available for them. Actually, I'm trying to think who played for them in that game. How many of them actually are at the IPL already? But either way, they, Markram obviously being available for them was a huge boom. I think he made lots of runs, but more interesting than that, also bowled and took some wickets as well. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. But the other thing is that, they're trying to make a World Cup. And we saw what happened when they were trying to qualify for the next round against the Dutch in the World Cup. It's just so much more interesting how the bilaterals don't seem to affect them. They made, what was it, 370, and they bowled them out for 224. The psychology of that whole South African thing, and I know we've all talked about it to death, and the choking and the problems and the issues and all the things that have happened to them. But this is just as important, right? And when they played the Dutch in the cold hard day, the glaring lights of the World Cup, they didn't look anything like this. And then suddenly they play them in one day. And I do think the Dutch team is a much better T20 team than it is a one-day team. But even so, it's interesting how much they've won. I mean, they're going to have to continue that, of course. But I find that, just very South Africa, that suddenly they're in bilaterals again. And even when the bilaterals matter, they're absolutely cruising through them. That series against England, I'm trying to think how full. I think that was a fairly good team that England put out too. But that series against England is a really, really interesting one to show how good they are. And of course, they will all disappoint us again when it comes to the World Cup if they do qualify, which it now looks like they will. But isn't it fun that they have to qualify? Imagine that. In the old days, all you needed to do was get test status. And here's a fun story. I've probably told it before. Here's a fun story. South Africa basically got test status because a lot of rich English people wanted to visit there. And so they were given test status despite the fact that they didn't play a lot of cricket. They weren't particularly good at cricket. They couldn't really afford to get good at cricket at that point. They played against fourth and fifth string England teams, players like the great was it Charles Aubrey? No, if I got his name wrong. The old captain that went on to be the Hollywood actor anyway, playing his only test match against South Africa. A lot of guys who'd never played first-class cricket and only played first-class cricket in test matches against South Africa. That's the sort of teams that they used to send over there. But people were desperate to go and have a holiday and down in Cape Town. And so off an England team went off. And because of that weird quirk and the fact that we decided years later that some of those matches were test matches, despite the fact they weren't called test matches at that time. Or sorry, they were. Everything was called a test match, but they weren't really considered major matches at that time. And then to think that other than, an apartheid ban, they basically were just allowed to go to every World Cup because in 1890, someone said, I'd like to have a holiday in South Africa. It's a very, very interesting sport that we have, that those sorts of quirks exist. Anyway, if anyone has any super chats, feel free to pop them up. But there are some non-super chats. Not that they're not super, just that they don't come up as super chats. So we've got a few here. Blah blah says, how does Cricinfo make enough money to pay the journalists, scorers, and ex-cricketer analysts? Is it really just the ads on their website? Well, it's owned by Disney. They have 40 million unique users a month. I think that's right. It might be more. Those are the numbers I last remember hearing from them. I think any website with 40 million unique users is certainly going to get a good amount of money off their advertising. The other thing that Cricinfo gets is the average amount of time, and this is even compared to a website like CricBuzz, which is a different version of the same thing. Cricinfo gets an incredibly large amount of time per user. So again, I don't know what the actual numbers are these days, but I do remember when I was there that the average time spent on the Guardian's website was like 3 seconds or 7 seconds, something ridiculous. Whereas the average time on Cricinfo was over a minute. And that means that, and that's because of the scorecards, right? People on the live ball by ball summaries and all those sorts of things. But it does, for an advertiser, that's absolutely huge, right? So there's a lot of money to be made from advertising, but it's also a strategic play by ESPN. I'll be honest, when I worked there, I always thought they could make a lot more money from advertising. I didn't think that the ESPN advertising understood cricket. I didn't think they understood the market that they were trying to deal with. They never had like a specialist in Bangladesh trying to get advertising for them, despite the fact that that was a very, that it's a hugely popular website in Bangladesh. They let a lot of own goals go, but a lot of the reasons that they didn't do all that sort of stuff is because it was seen as more of a strategic play for ESPN and cricket than anything else. But yeah, no, it does make money. Anything with 40 million unique users, it's going to make money. The SS, or Bloody Bugger on Patreon, says, what can you tell me about Prasanna Jayawardene? Oh, yeah, I saw this. I saw you put that message up, but sorry, I hadn't had a chance to have a look at it. I was not following Test cricket when he was playing. Have heard he was one of the best pure wicket keepers in history. Yeah, I think what Prasanna was a very interesting... I'm trying to think of the best way of putting it, but he was a very natural wicket-keeping athlete. So nothing like someone like Adam Gilchrist or Quinton de Kock, or those sorts of people. But I think Prasanna had that incredible sideways movement. So you see that what I'm trying to think of some other sports. I suppose tennis players have it. NBA defenders have it. There's a few sports where you have that. And, his ability, he was very powerful at moving from side to side, which when you're up at the stumps to a wicket keeper up at the stumps as a wicket keeper, to spin as much as he was beautiful at that. And having his foot, a lot of modern wicket keepers wicket keep with their hands. This is going to sound stupid if you've never played cricket, but you should actually wicket keep with your feet, because if you can get over to them, you're taking everything under your eyes rather than at the side of your eyes. And that's when the majority of the mistakes happen. And he was absolutely brilliant at that, had very soft hands. As a batter, look, you put his batting stats into a wicket keeper 10 or 15 years earlier, and I don't think there was anything wrong with it. I want to say I saw him make 100, but I feel like I saw him play a really important innings along the line. He was at probably a below average number 7, but would have been, an above average number 8 with the bat. But yeah, beautiful wicket keeper, sort of a supernatural feel for where the ball was going. I always felt I would say that after Jack Russell, we got James Foster in there as well. I would say that probably those were the guys that were just the best natural wicket keepers that made the international level. If you've ever watched first class cricket, these guys do occasionally happen, although it's gone now. But we certainly had a few of them before in professional level. But at the international level, I think Prasanna was the best modern wicket keeper by a distance. But also, he was picked as a wicket keeper, and I don't want to knock some of the other players out there, but they're not picked as wicket keepers, right? So you wouldn't expect them to be as good as someone who was brought up. And the one other thing I would say about Sri Lanka is that the ball spins there further than anywhere else. It's got the highest spin degree, I think, on the Hawkeye tracking and the CricViz metrics and everywhere else. And so it is a harder place to go there with a non-specialist wicketkeeper in a way that, let's say, the UAE, which always had spin, you may not quite need that same kind of specialist in that way. So he was an absolutely beautiful wicketkeeper. Always happy to talk about him. Probably, I wonder if one day we'll look back on him being one of the last true specialists of a major team. We've seen some specialists from some of the smaller teams, but I do wonder if he'll be the last specialist from a major team that we will see. That's not to say we won't ever see good wicket keeping again. Alan Knott, Les Ames, MS Dhoni. There's certainly guys who could wicket keep and bat before him. But whether we'll ever see a specialist wicket keeper whose wicket keeping is that special at the international level consistently, like we did with Prasanna, I don't know. Yuvashant says, why can't the Sri Lankan team struggle more? Why can't the Sri Lankan team struggle more in ODIs against a second-string New Zealand side? Is it because in T20s you can get away with bits and pieces players? I think he's saying why are they struggling more in ODI cricket than T20 cricket? I didn't see the ODIs, to be honest. So I think that I remember having a look at this a couple of years ago as they were coming through. It felt to me that Sri Lanka was about to put together a very good T20 team. In fact, when Mickey Arthur got the job, I think I sent him a message saying there's a lot about this T20 team I like, and it hasn't been developed the way that it should have. I don't feel the same way with their one-day side. So I'm not sure it's about the bits and pieces or anything else. I just think that, there is... We see this over and over again. Ireland was a really good example of this. A very good one-day side that didn't quite have the T20 pieces. And they are, I don't know if I say divergent, but they are diverging as different talent. I'm sure I've mentioned this recently, but Josh Butler's comments were really interesting about one-day cricket, where he hadn't played much and came back to play against South Africa, and he was sort of saying that he needed to relearn it. It was Nicholas Puran who really took me through it step by step of how different it is than T20 cricket when you're out in the middle. And I'm sure it's the same for the bowlers as well. So just having white ball talent, you need specific talent for each format. But yeah, I think I missed the one day. So I've only got the T20, and they look pretty good in the T20. They should have won that game in regulation time. And then obviously there was a bit of a shocker with the New Zealand had a bit of a shocker with the Super Over, and Sri Lanka won there. Han says, do you think the impact player may be more fun if it was only for a limited number of overs rather than just an extra player? I think it would be more fun if it was unlimited from that perspective, and that and then you could pick from 15 players and just change them. So you could always have spare spinners or spare quicks in the side. You could, you go out there and and you suddenly you realize that I'm trying to even think. You've got the squad, the team set up slightly wrong with an 11, but with 15, you have the ability to sort of never have to worry about that. Have those other players around. We don't have to see as many overs bowled by fifth and sixth bowlers, because you will have enough frontliners in your team. Teams can go harder knowing that they have 10 legitimate batters, or at least 8 legitimate batters, and maybe a couple of hitters down the order. I just think it would be a much better spectacle. We'd see the best against the best more often. My guess is, other than cricket being, conservative by nature, my guess is the other reason is that you'd have to have more players available to you in your squad, and that might knock people back. But I would love to see it that way. Oh God, I can't read from this distance. I'm too far from my iPad. Yuvishant says, what's the likely pitch conditions in Zimbabwe for the World Cup qualifiers, and can Sri Lanka qualify? Generally, the ball spins a lot in Zimbabwe. Slower wickets. I'm trying to think what you would say. They're not really like Sri Lankan wickets. They may be more, I want to say UAE, but that's probably unfair to them because there's a little bit more pep in them. But they're like a slow South African wicket combined with like UAE type conditions at times. That's why you see a lot of those sort of part-timey finger spinners come through in Zimbabwe. So from that perspective, there's no problem for Sri Lanka in those conditions. I think, none of it's ideal. They probably wouldn't want to be trying to qualify in the first place, but I don't think there's anything in the conditions that is going to cause them the tournament's not being played in Ireland. Where else would be tricky? Ireland or Scotland or somewhere like that, or Netherlands. To pick some of the European places where you're not quite sure what the wickets are going to be like at times. If that's the case, it would be very, very different. But I think for Sri Lanka, Zimbabwe is a fairly good match for them. Sumit says, it was the 2011 World Cup anniversary yesterday. Do you think the Sri Lankan white ball team from 2007 to 14 was one of the best teams in limited overs ever? Multiple finals in different conditions, still not talked about enough. Yeah, I did something, Sumit, recently on the Sri Lankan T20 and one-day side, probably pretty much that era that you were talking about. Because, obviously they were really bad after that, right? And so I was looking that up, and the more you look through the names and the players that they had, you do think to yourself, this was so much better as a team than we even gave it credit for at the time. And I think it's really at that early point, sort of maybe before cricket Twitter takes over and everything else. Sri Lankan media is, of course, it's not that they don't have cricket journalists, but a lot of their cricket media isn't outside. I would say that Cricinfo didn't have a full-time Sri Lankan consult writer back then. I don't know when Fernando started, actually. So maybe he was just starting off. And he's probably more of a test guy anyway, I would say. So that probably played a part. Crick buzz wasn't really an issue back in those days. So, yeah, I do think it was missed. And Well, I think now, what are we, 9 years on? Cricket's just covered a lot better from a global. I mean, the reason I got a job was because I covered global cricket, and you got to remember I was getting hired in that point. But I agree with you. I think looking back, it's a really, really interesting period of which you look at the IPL players as well that they created and the T20 players around the world. Dilshan, you had Murali, you had Malinga, Jaminda Vas was still playing. Kumar and Mahela. I'm trying to think who else. There was a lot of really interesting Sri Lankan talent around at that point. Playing for them, and they were successful in both the formats. So they won the 2014 World Cup. They lost the 2012 World Cup in the final. They lost the 2009 World Cup in the final. I'm trying to think what else they did. So it was a very, very good period. And I do think that if another team had done that, we would have talked about it a lot more. But yeah, I was looking the numbers up recently, and they were just an exceptional side. Jake says, do you think Guptill should or will make this year's World Cup? I tell you what I should do. I can barely read any of this. I need to make the font bigger. I somehow made it smaller. Brilliant work. There we go. Do I think he should? No. Do I think he will? I think I could see him going over as the squad batter, but I don't think he should play, and I don't think he will play. I just don't think his game is as strong as it needs to be now, and I think they just have so many other options available to them. Perhaps because they don't have Ross Taylor, and we don't know what Kane's elbow / now knee is going to be like. There is a call for having that one senior white ball player there, so I could see him in that role. I don't think I see him as a frontline 11 player though anymore. He's had a fantastic career. He's a very interesting cricketer. I've talked about this a lot before. He doesn't always make sense to me, but he has been a fantastic player for them, and I think he's going to go down as one of the highest one-day run scorers of all time, and obviously, one of the highest T20 international run scorers of all time. And I think he deserves all that. I just think this is one World Cup too far for him. I didn't think he should have played in the last World Cup either. And that was the T20 one, obviously. I just think he's just not quite the player that he used to be. But as a squad member, I can see why they would still be thinking, there's a reason to have him there. Sports Breakdown says, can Kusal Pereira come back in ODI team after yesterday's knock of 50? We badly need him back for ODI cricket. Perhaps Kusal Mendes can open up with Nasanka. It's an interesting one. We will eventually, I'm sure me and Cheyenne will do this. It's something that I really want to do, which is looking at if you could trade international players, where you would go. And one of the players I thought of instantly was him. There's obviously a reason why it hasn't quite worked for him in Sri Lanka. And he's played one of the best test innings of all time. It's a ridiculous situation to be in. But something hasn't worked for him there. And whether he just needs a fresh start, whether he needs to move. I always remember, this is a completely different kind of player and everything else. But you do see players, and Michael Klinger was a perfect example. Michael Klinger played for Victoria. I don't know, he was about 12 when he started. Never made any runs, really struggled. And he just looked, no matter what his age was, he played like a 16-year-old. Just felt like he could never hit the ball off the square. And of course, he went to South Australia, slightly different kind of ground, slightly different kind of kit. Suddenly starts making runs everywhere, and then becomes, this sort of, what would you say, like a sheet anchor type player in one-day cricket, and a very good red ball cricketer as well. And you do look at some of these international cricketers and you think, is it just the wrong setup? Is there too many of their kind of player there? Is there, not the right kind of coaching structure? Have they been done over at a young age by the selectors? Whatever that may be. And because international cricket international sport just doesn't work that way, right? And so it's a really, really interesting thing to think of how he could go. Look, I'm going to find it hard to ever not believe in him. And Kyle Mayers is the same at a certain point, just because once you play one of the best test innings of all time, how do you go back from that and say that this person's just an average player? And it's easy for someone like me to sit back on the stats and saying this. Sometimes a player's not in the right situation, and I just wonder if that's his case. And unfortunately for Sri Lankan cricket, there's nothing you can do. You can't trade. I'm not sure if that answered your question at all, but I had fun. Let's do one last break here on the Uncovered podcast, and I will press the wrong button. Yeah, let's do one last break, and then we'll come down, and I'll just hit other questions that we can get to. And if there's nothing else there
is something wrong in the cricket world, and while it may not be a conspiracy, there does seem to be a movement towards leaving more grass on the wicket, and thusly, the global batting average has dropped. If a similar thing has happened to you in your personal life, try Manscaped. Their Lawnmower 4.0 will help you trim any unwanted pubic grass. And once your downstairs track is taken care of, you can also use Manscaped's liquid formulations. So before heading outside, use the Crop Preserver ball deodorant to stay cool in the heat. And if you've been playing too many games recently and you need some help with your strip, why don't you go and get their Crop Reviver? I think I may possibly have taken all of this analogy too far. But the point is, Manscaped sells items that allow you to shave your pubic itch pitch. Use the code REDINKER, all one word, which is the name of my podcast, and you can get a 20% discount and free worldwide shipping while you curate your special strip like a team of sweaty men hoping it doesn't rain.
Okay, let's finish off with a couple of easy ones. Oh, God, I've got to actually click the button, don't I? How do I make this smaller again? Rohit says, are you wearing an Oakland A's hat? I am. I didn't bring my normal Surrey cap with me. It's like it stays on my desk. So I always remember to have it when I want to film. Oakland A's. So I own Oakland A's and Detroit Tigers stuff because it's the only major league teams I saw play. I saw them play in a playoff game a few years ago with the Tigers. I think the Tigers had the Australian pitcher, whose name I always forget, who was basically unhittable at that stage, and they won that game easily. But I went to the Coliseum. I'm not a massive baseball fan by any stretch of the imagination, but I think through being a movie fan and probably a fan of writing, sports writing as well. I followed. I've got a lot of friends who obviously who work in baseball as well. I've been on some of their podcasts and stuff and chat to them at times. And but yeah, I suppose the A's are my team if the Tigers are not my team. But I don't really follow it that closely at all. I usually look for trends within baseball. I follow some of the more analytic types just to see what they're with from that perspective, because it might help in cricket. Shahid said, how do you think Ireland will do in the test against Bangladesh? Well, having a look at the white ball cricket, we'll put any money on them. Look, I think Ireland bowl spin particularly well, and I don't think their bat against spin particularly well. Not a great place to go to then, Bangladesh, is it? So I said that for the white ball cricket, and that held up pretty well. I'm going to go again with the red ball cricket. I just think it's great that they're playing a test match there, though, and that they're getting another chance to play a test match. Andy Balboni has been the captain-elect for quite some time now. So as someone who knows him and roots for him a little bit, it's great to see him have a chance at captaining Ireland in a test match against Bangladesh, and I hope they do well. Hope they give Bangladesh a fair fight, but I just don't see it happening at the moment. Matthew says, if England lose the Ashes badly, could that be the end of Bazball? Or what would it take to move away from it? Or will England now Bazball forever? So here's the thing about I've been thinking about this quite a lot from a theoretical point of view. The majority of England's best white ball batters are over 30. I won't go into my whole Pro 40 thing. I probably need to do a Pro 40 video, actually. I don't think I've done the Pro 40 video. I wrote an article for it for the Cricketer, but it's a very fascinating subject. You don't see many England cricketers under the age of 30 who have those same skills of just knocking the ball everywhere at a high average and a high strike rate. So, the best players are Bairstow and Roy, was Morgan, Root, Milan, Butler, even someone like Moeen. These are all guys who played Pro 40 cricket, been around for a long time. Who are the best England batters under 30? So Livingston's what, almost 30? Phil Salt's, I don't know Phil Salt's age. He's a potential. And obviously you got Harry Brook. What you don't see, though, is an absolute plethora of guys who can come through and smash all the bowling in the world around the way that we saw with that previous generation. At the moment, things might change. That Bazball batting style, anyway, doesn't need that, right? It does need enough of those guys to be able to come through and be able to do that. This may be something that happens, and we don't have to worry about it going ahead. But right at the moment, I think that's an interesting one. Then we go over to your Ashes point. If they lose the Ashes, will they stop this ball? No, I don't think so. I think if they're traditional English wickets with traditional Dukes balls, it'd be really interesting to see how Bazball goes. But I don't think, with all their success so far, if they just lost the Ashes against a team that should also do very well in those conditions, I don't think they need to completely revitalize it. I do think if that's the Ashes and lost, I don't know, one of the next two series after that, that's the point where they go, maybe we just got a little bit lucky, or maybe teams have worked it out. I've got a video coming up about how I think teams have already started to evolve to play against England in this way. And if that is the case, like I think it is, then that's a bigger challenge than just one individual team. And if teams start to work it out more and more, I will be interested going ahead in how that plays out. But as it currently stands, if they lose the Ashes, even if they lost them 5-0 at home, which is unlikely, I just don't see that as a reason enough for them to get rid of it, because they've won so many tests, on the bounce outside of that. And then last one today, he says, without being able to click it, is Sports Breakdown says, thoughts of my bowlers like Bumrah and other unorthodox fast bowlers get injured quite a lot. Is it because their action or any other reasons for this to occur? I think you'll see if you bowl over 85 miles an hour, even over 80 miles an hour, your body will break down. I think if you talk to the biomechanic experts, they would probably say that there is a slightly higher ratio of doing this if you have a slightly unorthodox technique. But some of the best bowlers with the best techniques ever still broke down. The truth is that fast bowling is a horrendous thing that no human being should do. I remember you talking about substitutions and everything. Someone said to me once that, it was someone on our Discord channel, which you can sign up to via Patreon, was saying that, we should allow subs in for injuries. And I said, if you did that, any fast bowler at any stage could prove they were injured, because it's very rare that a fast bowler is fully fit and that they have no niggles and there isn't something wrong. Their heel isn't hurting, their toe isn't bleeding, there isn't swelling on their ankle or their knee, or, their hips are feeling great, or their back isn't. All those things happen to them every time they bowl. If you are bowling fast, it is a really hard thing to do. And I think from that perspective, unorthodox techniques might have a slightly higher injury rate, but realistically, bowling fast is the thing that has the high injury rate. Anyway, just a huge thanks to everyone for coming on. Remember to bug Bharat as much as possible and get him to finally show up for one of these. But big thanks to everyone for asking questions here and for supporting us so far. We have a new sponsor lined up soon, and that is all because of you guys. But if you can subscribe, do all those things that everyone tells you to do in all the videos, that would certainly help from that perspective. And we'd love to continue to do this and make more and more videos. There's a couple of interesting things coming up shortly that I think people will like, but I won't announce them soon. Although one of them might be, that Bharat Sundaresan may come back to this podcast. No promises, of course, no promises, but you never know. But thanks to everyone in the chat today, and I'll be around in a couple of days for Wagon Wheel.
A little bit of grass on the wicket is good, but too much and all hell breaks loose. Not enough and things can go sideways very quick. The same is true of your pubic hair. And you don't have a groundsman who smells like fertilizer telling you what to do. No, you are the curator of your own pubic pitch. So if you're having trouble grooming your pitch, what about Manscaped? They've invented a sleek, well-designed, optimized trimmer that helps you shave your balls. I've used it, and it's incredible. It's good enough to use at Lord's. So get 20% off and free worldwide shipping with the code REDINKA. And you just put that in at manscaped.com. That's 20% off, free worldwide shipping, manscaped.com. The code is REDINKA. I always thought this podcast took balls more seriously than anyone else. Then I tried Manscaped.